Rosa wiped the espresso wand with a rag that had seen better mornings, and when the first mortar landed, she did not flinch, did not spill, did not so much as look up from the cup she was pouring for the corporal, who had been rude to her every day for a month. "You'll want to drink that fast," she told him, and slid it across the counter. The corporal, whose name was Petro, and who had a way of looking at people as though they were furniture, opened his mouth to say something clever. The second round came in before he could. It walked closer than the first, close enough that the tin roof of the little coffee stand shivered, and the sugar packets did a small nervous dance in their basket. Petro spilled his coffee down his own front. Rosa did not spill anything. She was already reaching under the counter for a bag she kept there, canvas, faded, heavy at one end in a way that a bag of coffee filters is not heavy. Nobody at Firebase Vanguard knew much about the woman who ran the coffee stand, except that she was quiet, that she had shown up 8 months ago with paperwork that said morale and welfare contractor, and that she made the only decent cup between here and the coast. She was not big. She did not raise her voice. When the young ones got loud around her, she smiled and let them be loud. Someone had decided, early, that she was soft, and the decision had spread the way those decisions do, unexamined, passed hand to hand, like a rumor that saves everyone the trouble of looking. She lifted the bag onto the counter and unzipped it, and Petro, wiping coffee off his shirt, glanced down and went still. "That's not," he said, and stopped. "Drink your coffee, Corporal," Rosa said. "It's going to be a long morning, and I promise you're going to want to have had it." Outside, the sirens began. Too late to be a warning, and just in time to be the truth. If you're the kind of person who stays till the end, stay till the end of this one, because in about 40 minutes, a woman that everyone on that base had walked past 100 times is going to carry a man twice her weight out of a burning motor pool with her own 2 hands, and the men who laughed at her are going to be the ones who can't look at her afterward. Hit subscribe, tell me in the comments what city you're listening from, and don't skip out early, because the part that matters most happens after the shooting stops. Now, back to it. The bag held a rifle in 3 pieces, and Rosa put it together the way other people button a coat. She had learned the trade from her grandfather, though he would have laughed to hear it called a trade, and he would have hated the uses she had put it to. He had been a clockmaker in a town that no longer existed under the name he'd known it by, and he had spent 40 years bent over movements so small he worked with a glass screwed into his eye socket. Rosa had sat at his elbow from the time she was 6. He never let her rush. That was the whole of his teaching, really, distilled. He would take the tweezers out of her hand if he saw her hurry, physically take them, and set them on the bench and fold his hands and wait until she was calm enough to be trusted with a spring that could vanish into the floorboards forever if it got away from her. "The clock does not care that you are in a hurry," he told her once, in the language they spoke at home, which was not the language of this base or this army or this war. "The clock keeps its own time. You keep the clock's time, not yours. You slow down until you are as slow as the clock. Then, and only then, you may touch it." She had touched a great many things since then that were not clocks, but the lesson held. Under pressure, she did not speed up. She slowed down until she was as slow as the thing she was working on, and the world seemed to slow with her. And in that widened space, she found room to do what other people, hurrying, could not. The rifle came together. She seated the bolt, checked the glass, and the optic she screwed on last had been sitting in a coffee tin behind the creamer since March. There was a man named Salter she had never called. He had been her spotter years ago, and 2 wars ago. A big, slow, calm Mississippian who chewed gum in a way that drove her mad, and who had once talked her through 11 hours on a rooftop with nothing but a canteen between them, and had never, in all the years since, asked her for a single thing. He had left the life before she did. Last she heard, he was running a hardware store outside Tupelo and had a daughter starting college. She owed him a phone call. She had owed him the phone call for 3 years. He had written her twice, real letters, paper, and she had read them both standing at a mailbox and folded them back into their envelopes and carried them around until they went soft at the creases. And she had never written back, because to write back was to say something true about how she was, and she had not known how to say it, and so she had said nothing, and the nothing had grown into a wall she could no longer see over. Every few months she picked up a phone and got as far as his number and set it down. It was the one thing she could not make herself finish. The clock does not care that you are in a hurry, but some things aren't clocks. Some things you just have to pick up. The first month she was at Vanguard, she'd fixed the coffee machine when it died, and she'd fixed it in a way that made a sergeant named Delacroix stop and watch. He was the base's senior maintenance chief, a compact man in his 50s with grease permanently in the creases of his knuckles. 22 years in, and not one of them spent being impressed by anybody. The industrial espresso unit had thrown a fault the whole base treated as a death, and the contractor rep was 3 weeks out, and Rosa had taken the side panel off with a butter knife and looked into it for a while without touching anything. Delacroix had wandered over to watch her fail, because watching people fail at machines was one of his few pleasures. She hadn't failed. She'd found a solenoid that was sticking, not dead, and instead of forcing it, she'd warmed it with her hands and worked it loose by feel, 100 tiny movements, patient past the point where he'd have lost his temper and broken it. "Where'd you learn hands like that?" he'd said. Not a question, exactly. "My grandfather," she'd said. "He fixed watches." Delacroix had grunted, which from him was a decoration. After that, he brought her the things that needed patience: a seized valve, a stripped fitting somebody else had rounded off, and she brought him the ones that needed a second pair of eyes, and the 2 of them developed the wordless shorthand of people who respect each other's hands. He never asked what she'd done before the coffee stand. He'd been around long enough to know that some people's paperwork was a door painted on a wall. Petro, though. Petro was another matter. Petro had come up loud, a big handsome kid from a big handsome family, first in his group at everything. And he had decided the day he arrived that a woman running a coffee stand was a punchline, and he'd worked that punchline hard. "Careful, she'll foam you to death," he'd say when she walked past. "Watch out, incoming latte." The others laughed because he was funny and because it was easier than not laughing. She'd let him. She had learned a long time ago that a man who needs you to be small will find a way to make you small in his own head no matter what you do. And the only real freedom is to stop attending the show he's putting on about you. But she wasn't a saint, and there was a morning she couldn't help herself. Petro had been going on about his marksmanship scores, loudly, to a table of the newer soldiers. and he'd finished by saying that anybody who couldn't shoot expert simply wasn't trying. And one of the kids had asked her, half as a joke, whether she'd ever fired a gun. "Once or twice," Rosa said, wiping the counter. "Yeah." Petro had turned around, grinning, scenting blood. "What did you qualify?" "I didn't," she said, which was true, because the things she'd done had never had a qualification card printed for them. And then, because the kids were watching, and because Petro's grin was so wide and so sure, she'd added, mild as milk, "I mostly just point it at what I want to hit." The table had roared. Petro thought they were laughing with him. Delacroix, 2 tables over, had not laughed, and had looked at her for a long moment over his coffee, and she'd caught his eye and gone back to wiping the counter, and something had passed between them that the kids were too young to see. And there was a night, a good night, that mattered later for reasons none of them could have guessed. The generators had gone down, and the whole base sat in the dark, and somebody had produced a guitar, and somebody else a bottle of something that was definitely against regulations, and Rosa had kept the coffee going by hand off a camp stove, and told a story about a goat in her grandfather's village that had learned to open the church door. And she'd told it so well, drawing it out, doing the priest's voice and the goat's face, that even Petro laughed until he couldn't breathe. And for the length of one story, on one dark night, the whole exhausted lot of them were just people around a light. Delacroix caught her eye across the flame and lifted his cup an inch. She lifted hers back. There was a private named Okafor who was on burn detail the week before it happened, and he saw a thing he never had the words for. He was carrying a case of water past the coffee stand when a jar of coffee beans went off the edge of the counter, bumped by somebody's pack, and it fell. And he watched Rosa's hand come out and catch it, not snatch it, catch it, cushioning down with the fall, so the beans didn't even jump inside the glass, and set it back up on the counter in one continuous motion without her seeming to look at it, while she went on pouring the cup in her other hand without spilling a drop. Okafor stopped. He stood there with his case of water, and he felt like he'd seen something, and he didn't know what, and he almost said something, and then didn't, because he couldn't think how to start. It bothered him for days. It was the kind of thing your body understands before your mouth does, that the hand that caught that jar hadn't caught 1,000 things, that it was not a lucky hand, but a trained one, that there was a whole life standing behind that one small motion that he would never get to see. He went back to his water, but he remembered it. The third mortar round took the generator shed, and the lights that were still on went out, and the base radio net dissolved into the sound of a lot of people finding out at the same time that the wire had been breached. It was not a raid. Raids come and go. This was a siege, planned, patient. A couple hundred fighters who had waited for the right morning and cut the road behind them and meant to be inside the wire by noon. Vanguard held 91 souls that morning. Rosa knew the number because she had counted heads at the coffee stand the way she counted everything, quietly, out of an old habit that had kept people alive. 91. That was the number now. That was the number that had to still be 91 when the sun went down, or as close to it as anybody could drag it. The command post got a call out before the antenna went. Relief was 90 minutes away by air. Gunships and lift, if the base could hold a landing zone. 90 minutes. 91 people. The math sat in Rosa's chest like a stone as she slung the rifle across her back and went out the low side of the coffee stand into a morning full of smoke. Major Halstead found her on the catwalk of the water tower 20 minutes later, and he was not a man who found things easily anymore. He was the base commander, and he was the one who 8 months ago had read her file and the classified annex clipped behind it and had made the decision, a reasonable decision, a coward's decision, to let her be what her cover said she was. He had known. That was the thing he would carry. He had known exactly who was pouring coffee on his base, and he had decided it was cleaner to leave her buried, to let his men believe the joke, because a live asset, undeclared, was worth more than a woman with her dignity, and he had told himself that story until this morning, when the wire came down and he stood in his shattered command post and understood that the most dangerous person on his base had spent 8 months being called a latte by children. He climbed the tower himself. His knees were bad, and he climbed it anyway. "Chief Ramos," he said when he reached the catwalk, using the name and the rank that were on the annex and not on the coffee stand. It came out of him rough. "I owe you a conversation we don't have time for. So I'll say the front of it now, and the rest of it after, if there's an after." He stopped. He made himself look at her. "I knew what you were. I sat on it. That was mine, and it was wrong. And every man out there who ever called you soft is calling you soft because I let them. I'm sorry, and I have no right in the world to ask you what I'm about to ask you." Rosa looked at him for a moment. Then she keyed the radio he'd handed her, the command net, so the whole base heard the voice of the woman from the coffee stand for the first time as something other than a joke. "This is Ramos," she said, flat and clear, and utterly without hurry. "I'm on the tower. I have eyes on the east approach and the motor pool. Give me the count of who's still out, and get everybody who can move toward the vehicle bays. I'll keep the east off your backs. Ramos out." There was a silence on the net that had a texture to it. Somewhere down in the command post, a young radio operator looked up at the men around him and said out loud what all of them were thinking: "Who is that?" The tower gave her the east and the motor pool, and a stretch of the wire, and for the first 40 minutes, she made the east a place men did not want to be. She did not fire fast. She fired the way her grandfather had turned a screw, one considered motion at a time, and the fighters coming through the eastern draw learned that the open ground between the outer berm and the vehicle bays was a killing space owned by somebody they could not locate. She moved after every third shot, breaking the tower's silhouette, using the tank and the ladders, and the geometry of it kept them guessing. A machine gun opened up on the tower and walked its fire up the legs, and she was already gone, flat on the catwalk on the far side, feeling the rounds ring the steel through her chest like a struck bell. Delacroix reached her on the net, breathing hard. "Ramos, we got wounded in the aid station, and no way to the LZ that isn't open ground. The bays are the only cover that runs the whole way. But the motor pool's cooking. A round went into the fuel point, and it's burning, and Torres is in there." "Who's Torres?" "My night mechanic. Went in for the fire bottles when it started, and the roof came down across the bay door. He's pinned. He's alive. He's on the shop phone, but that whole structure is going up, and I can't get a man across the open to him without losing the man." A pause, the cost of it audible. I'm not asking you to leave your gun." Rosa watched the motor pool burn for the space of 2 breaths. The fire had the roof now, and the black smoke of a fuel fire climbed straight and greasy into the morning. She thought about Torres, whom she had served coffee, a wiry, cheerful man who took 4 sugars and always said thank you like he meant it. "How long can he breathe in there?" she said. "I don't know. Not long." "Keep him talking," Rosa said. "I'm going to work the problem. Stay off this channel, unless it's him." She turned back to the east, because the east still had to be held, or none of it mattered. And she put down 2 fighters who'd use the lull to rush the berm. And while her hands did that, her mind was in the motor pool, walking it, the way she'd walked the inside of the coffee machine before she touched it. The wounded had to cross to the bays. The bays ran to the LZ under cover. But the fighters had a gun up on the eastern watercourse now, a heavy one, dug in behind the concrete abutment of the old irrigation channel that ran along the base's flank, and that gun could see the whole run to the bays, and as long as it lived, nobody crossed. She could not reach the crew. The abutment was 3 feet of poured concrete, and they were tucked in behind it, firing through a gap, and she could put every round she had into that concrete and do nothing but chip it. She called Delacroix back. "The irrigation channel, the concrete abutment on the east flank. How old is that channel?" "Older than the base? Colonial, maybe. Why?" "Poured concrete or block?" "Poured. Why, Ramos?" She was already looking at it through the glass, and now she was looking at it the way her grandfather looked at a movement that had stopped. Not at the part that was obviously broken, but at the part that was carrying the load. And she saw it. Above and behind the gun position, where the old channel came down off the higher ground, there was a header, a raised concrete sluice, a water gate, a great heavy trough of the stuff held up on 2 thin piers. And it was full, because the rains had come, and it had been full for weeks, and the whole colonial mass of it was standing on 2 pillars no thicker than a man. "Delacroix," she said, "I need you to tell me something, and I need it to be right. That sluice above the channel, the raised trough, is it holding water right now?" A pause. "Yeah, it's been full since the rains. Whole hillside drains through it." "How much water?" "Tons." "Why does that—" And then she heard him get it, heard the mechanic in him arrive at the same place she had. "The piers. You're looking at the piers." "I'm looking at the piers," Rosa said. Here's the thing about a heavy load on a slender support. The thing her grandfather knew about a mainspring, and Delacroix knew about a jack, and the men who'd poured that sluice 2 centuries ago had known in their bones. It is not the load that fails it. It is the load plus a nudge. That trough had been standing on those 2 piers for 100 years, and it would stand for 100 more. Balanced, patient, the weight running straight down the way weight likes to. But the piers were old, and the water was heavy, and the whole thing was a spring wound tight and held. And a spring that is wound and held wants only one thing, which is an excuse. She couldn't knock down a pier with a rifle, but she did not need to knock it down. She needed to make it fail on one side. So the load shifted, so the weight that had been running straight down began to run sideways, and let the water do the rest. Because there were tons of it, and it all wanted to go downhill. And the only thing holding it up was 2 pillars and a habit. "Rosa," Delacroix's voice, careful, "talk me through it. Slow. I want to understand it. And Torres has got maybe 2 minutes of air. and I need to know if this is real. She talked him through it, slow, the way you explain a thing to a smart man who deserves to understand it and not just obey it. There's a construction joint, she said, at the base of the upstream pier. You can see it through the glass, a line, where they poured the footing one day and the pier the next. It's the weakest part of the whole structure. That seam, it always is. I'm not going to try to break concrete. I'm going to put rounds into that joint, into the same half-inch of it, one after another, and open the seam. Not blow it. Open it. Water finds a crack. Once water's in the joint, and the pier's already loaded off-center, the pier doesn't have to break. It just has to lean. And the moment it leans, the whole trough shifts its weight onto the downstream pier, which was never built to carry it alone. And that one goes. And then there's nothing under 100 years of water but a hillside that runs straight down through the channel and over the gun. Over the gun, Delacroix said. Over the gun. And I need you to get every one of our people back from the low ground on the east flank right now, because I am about to put a flood down that channel, and I don't own where it stops. A silence. Then, do it. I'm clearing the low ground. Torres, you hear me, buddy. Hang on. Help's coming. Keep breathing. Rosa settled in behind the rifle and became as slow as the clock. The joint was 1,100 meters out, a hairline in the shadow under the pier, and she had to put round after round into a target the width of 2 fingers into the same seam from a tower that a machine gun kept trying to find. She fired, worked the bolt, fired. She could see the concrete dust bloom from the joint, a small pale flower each time, and she chased it, walking her impacts into a line along the seam, and the gun crew below never knew they were being killed by something above and behind them because they were watching the open ground and death was coming from the water gate at their backs. 6 rounds. 8. The pale flower of dust turned dark at its edges, and she knew before she saw it that water had found the seam, a thread of it, then a rope of it, and the upstream pier, loaded off-center for 100 years, and patient about it, finally found its excuse. It leaned, just a few degrees. Enough. The trough shifted with a groan she could hear even at that distance, even over everything, a deep tectonic complaint of old concrete, and the load came off the leaning pier and onto the downstream one all at once. And the downstream pier did what a single, slender pillar does when you hand it the weight of 2, which is nothing at all for one long, held instant, and then everything at once. It went, and 100 years of held water remembered it was water, and came down the channel in a brown wall, and the concrete abutment that had sheltered the gun and the gun crew was simply not a factor anymore, was underwater, was gone downstream with everything tucked behind it, and the run to the bays was open. "East flank's clear," Rosa said into the net, in exactly the voice she used to say the coffee was ready. "Move your wounded, and somebody get me eyes on that motor pool, because I'm coming down." She came down off the tower, and this was the part the title had promised, the part that was never her trade, the part she did with her hands. The rifle had held the east. The rifle could not carry Torres. So she left it slung, and she crossed the open ground herself, low, fast, while Okafor and 2 others put fire onto the far berm to keep the fighters' heads down. Okafor, who a week ago couldn't say what he'd seen, laying down, suppressing fire, so the coffee stand woman could reach the fire, and doing it steady, doing it right, buying her the ground with his own exposure. She reached the motor pool in a heat that pushed against her like a hand. The roof had come down across the main bay in a tangle of steel purlins, and Torres was under the edge of it, pinned from the waist by a fallen beam and a workbench that had folded on top of him, conscious, gray-faced, coughing in the smoke that layered down from the burning roof. The fuel point burned 20 feet away, and the fire was walking toward them, across a floor slick with spilled oil. "Torres," she said, kneeling in front of him. "Rosa, from the coffee stand. 4 sugars." He laughed and coughed, and the laugh turned into something frightened. "Am I going to die in here?" She looked at the beam, at the bench, at the geometry of it, the way she looked at everything. "No," she said, "not a hope, a fact. You're going to be embarrassed about how you got out. That's all that's going to happen to you today." The beam was too heavy to lift, but it was not lying flat. It was cocked at an angle across a tool chest, and the whole weight of it ran down to a single point where it pinned him. And a weight on a lever is not a weight if you get under the long end. She found a length of broken purlin, 5 feet of steel, and she set it under the high end of the beam and put a wheel hub under it for a fulcrum, close to the load the way her grandfather set his tweezers close to the spring, because leverage is patience made physical. And she put her whole small body on the long end and did not yank at it, did not waste herself in a heave, but leaned, steady, adding herself to it ounce by ounce until the beam remembered it could move. And it lifted, an inch, 2, and Torres dragged himself back with a sound she would hear for years. Then she got him up. He couldn't walk, so she got him across her shoulders, a man half again her weight. In the carry her body knew from 100 drills in another life, and she stood up under him with her legs shaking and the fire at her back, and she walked him out of the burning motor pool into the smoke-brown daylight with her own 2 hands, one boot in front of the other, as slow as the clock, while the roof let go behind them and came down into the space where he had been. She reported it the way she'd have reported a full pot of coffee. "Command, Ramos. Torres is out. He's mobile with help. Gunshots clear on the east. Water took the flank gun. Get your birds in. The LZ's yours." She set Torres down against a HESCO barrier where a medic could reach him. And only then, with her hands out of anyone's sight below the wall, did she notice they had started to shake. A fine, hard tremor she couldn't stop. The whole 8 months and the whole morning arriving in her fingers at once. She held them against her own knees and breathed and let them shake. 91, she thought. She hadn't lost the count. The relief birds came in over a held LZ and lifted the wounded first, and the number that walked and limped and was carried on to them added up, at the end, to 91. The investigating officer they flew in 2 days later could not make the paper agree with the woman. His name was Whitfield, a lean, careful man, from the command's inspector general shop, and he had a folder, and the folder had a problem in it, which was that a morale and welfare contractor with no combat authorization had, per 40 separate witness statements, held an eastern approach, single-handed, dropped a fortified, crew-served position, by means the statements described in language he did not believe, and carried a wounded soldier out of a structure fire. He sat across a field table from her, with the folder open and his pen uncapped, and he tried, for the record, to make it smaller. "Ms. Ramos, your contract lists you as welfare support. It does. The statements describe 1100-meter precision fire, sustained, under counterfire. I've read the statements. You understand my difficulty. There's no qualification on file. There's no authorization. On paper, the person who did these things doesn't exist. Rosa looked at him, and there was nothing unkind in her face, only a great and level patience. Chief Warrant Officer Rosa Ramos, she said. There's an annex behind that folder. It's got a different classification than the rest. You'll have found it this morning because a man like you always looks. Read it to yourself. I'll wait. Whitfield's jaw worked. He had found it. She watched him decide not to pretend he hadn't. He turned 2 pages and read, and the color of the interview changed in front of her, the way the light changes when a cloud moves off. And when he looked up, his pen was capped. Major Halstead's initial report, he said quieter, attributes the Eastern defense to an unnamed contractor. Major Halstead wrote that report 8 months ago, Rosa said, and every day since. He's fixing it now. Let him. Whitfield closed the folder. The record's going to say what happened, he said. I'll see to that myself. It was, from a man like him, an apology, and she took it as one. It was Delacroix who sat with her the night before she flew out, on 2 crates behind the mess, with the generators humming, and the base dark and quiet, in the way a place is quiet after it has nearly ended and didn't. He'd brought 2 cups of the coffee she'd taught his people to make, and it wasn't as good as hers, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. You could have told me, he said, after a while. Not angry. 8 months. I brought you a stuck valve, like it was a hard day. It was a good stuck valve, she said. I liked the valve. He almost smiled. Then he didn't. Why didn't you? Tell somebody. Anybody. You stood there and let that Petro kid call you? He stopped. Why? And Rosa, in the dark, with a man who had respected her hands before he knew what they'd done, said the things she had told no one. Because I was tired of being her, she said, the one they send for this. You do it long enough, and it's all you are to anybody, a tool with a person painted on. I came out here to pour coffee and learn people's sugar and be nobody's last resort. 8 months I got to be a woman who makes a good cup and tells a story about a goat. That was the most like a person I've felt in 15 years. Her voice did a thing then, cracked clean across the middle, the only time in the whole business that it did. And the first morning it goes bad, I'm right back to being the tool. I wanted to stay her a little longer. That's all. That's the whole ugly little reason. Delacroix was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in the flat, certain voice of a man stating a torque spec, You're wrong about one thing. Only one? The goat story lady and the tower lady. You think they're 2 people, and one's real and one's the mask. He turned his cup in his grease-creased hands. I watched both of 'em for 8 months. Same hands, same patience. You catch a jar the same way you catch a bass. It's one person, Rosa. You've just never once let her be off duty long enough to notice she's always been there. He drank. That's not a tool. My tools don't tell goat stories. That's just you. All the way down. She didn't answer, but something in her chest that had been clenched for 15 years let go by a single degree, the way an old pier leans, the way a thing that has been holding a load forever finally shifts it. Somewhere it can be carried. The thing about Salter and the phone call didn't resolve because anyone made it resolve. Nobody flew in with the answer. She'd just decided the way Delacroix had said, because the deciding had been hers the whole time, and she'd finally caught up to it. She'd carried Salter's letters in her ruck for 3 years, soft at the creases, and she'd told herself the reason she couldn't write back was that she didn't know how to say how she was. Sitting on that crate after Delacroix went to bed, she took the letters out and read them again by the light off her phone, and she understood finally that Salter had never once asked how she was. He'd written about his hardware store and his daughter and the price of nails and a dog he'd got. He hadn't asked her to account for herself. He just wanted to know she was on the other end of the line. She'd built a wall 3 years high to keep out a question nobody had asked. There was a satellite phone in the command tent she was cleared to use now. She sat with it a long time. "The clock does not care that you are in a hurry," her grandfather said, in the language of home. She dialed the number she knew by heart and had never once let ring. It rang twice. A big, slow, calm voice she hadn't heard in 6 years said, "Ramos, if this is you, I swear to God." "It's me," she said. "I'm sorry it took so long. I got your letters. Both of them. I read them 100 times. I couldn't figure out what to say back. And then it got to be so long that the not saying was the thing I couldn't get past. And, Salter, how's the dog?" There was a silence on the line, the good kind, the kind with weight. Then Salter laughed, a laugh she felt in her sternum. "The dog's an idiot," he said. "Ate a whole tray of cornbread off the counter last week. My daughter named him after you, matter of fact, on account of he's small and he don't quit." A pause. "It's real good to hear your voice, Rosa. 3 years. You didn't have to figure out what to say. You just had to call." "I know that now," she said. "Yeah, well," she could hear him grinning. "You always were slow to the easy stuff. Fast on the hard stuff, slow on the easy stuff. Call me Sunday. My daughter will want to meet the person the dog's named after." "Sunday," she said, and meant it. And it was, in the end, the simplest thing she'd done in 3 years. And it had cost her nothing but the wall. Petro came to find her the morning she flew out, and it was the hardest thing she watched anyone do that week. He'd already done the other thing first, the thing he didn't know she knew about. Delacroix had told her once, flatly, without decoration, that when the birds were loading wounded and a stretcher had jammed in a door and the medic was screaming for hands, it was Petro who'd gone back across open ground twice, 3 times, exposed the whole way, and gotten the last 2 men aboard and told no one, and never mentioned it. He'd risked everything he had for people who'd never know. That was before the apology. The apology came after, and cost him more, because an apology has your name on it. He stood in front of her coffee stand, which was just a bent tin shell now, and he couldn't get it out clean. "I need to," he started and stopped, started again. "The stuff I said, the latte stuff, all of it. I thought I was..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I watched you carry Torres out of a fire. I wouldn't have gone near, and I've been calling you. For a month I've been..." He couldn't finish any of the sentences. He kept starting them and hitting the wall of what he'd been. "I don't have a way to say it that isn't small." Rosa let him stand in it a moment, not cruelly, just long enough that it was real. "Then don't say it," she said. "Drink it." She'd made him a coffee while he stalled. She slid it across the bent counter, the last cup off that stand, and Petro took it with both hands like it was something breakable, and drank it. And that was the whole of his forgiveness, and it was enough for both of them. Torres's wife found her at the airfield. Nobody had arranged it. She'd simply come, driven the cut road the moment it opened, a small round woman named Elena, with a grip like a vice. She didn't have any of the words. She didn't speak the language of Medivac and LZs and Eastern approaches. She just took Rosa's shaking hand. The tremor was still there, would be there in the cold and the tired from now on, a thing the morning had left in her fingers that no doctor would find a cause for. And she held it in both of hers and pressed it to her own face and said, in her own language, the same 3 words over and over, which meant, you gave him back, you gave him back, you gave him back. Rosa, who had a fact for every question and a flat, clear answer for every net, didn't know how to receive it. She stood there with her hand against a stranger's wet face and her own throat closing and no procedure for any of it. He takes 4 sugars, was all she could finally say, uselessly. And Elena laughed through the crying and said, yes, yes, 4, always 4, I tell him. I tell him. And the 2 of them stood on the tarmac, holding onto that one small, true thing while the rotors turned. Okafor was the one who finally said it at the end, the thing he'd been trying to say since the jar of beans. He caught her at the ramp of the aircraft, and he'd gotten older in a week, the way they all had. And he said, I saw you catch a jar of coffee beans once before all this. It fell off the counter, and you caught it without looking, and I couldn't figure out why it stuck with me. He shook his head. I get it now. It wasn't the catch. Anybody can catch a thing. It was that you weren't surprised. You knew right where it was going to be. He looked at her, this private who'd found the words at last. That's the whole thing about you, isn't it? You always know right where it's going to be. The jar, the gun, the water, all of it. You're already there. That's the nicest way anybody's ever said it, Rosa told him, and she meant that too. 2 years on, the coffee at Fire Base Vanguard is famous up and down the command, and nobody there can quite explain why a forward operating base makes coffee like a cafe in a real city. The reason has a paper trail, if you know to look. Delacroix made warrant officer and never left the maintenance world, but he wrote something into the base's standing procedures that the command adopted and then spread, half as a joke and half not, to a dozen other bases. A line item requiring a trained morale and welfare specialist forward, and a footnote in Delacroix's blunt hand that reads, personnel assigned to welfare tasks will be assumed competent until proven otherwise, not the reverse. See Vanguard AAR. It is the only place in the entire command's procedures where you will find the sentence a person is competent until proven otherwise, and every officer who's ever asked where it came from has gotten the same maddening non-answer from the maintenance chiefs, which is, you had to be there. Torres runs the fuel point still, both legs working, and there's a photo on the wall of his shop the new mechanics all ask about. A small woman and a wiry man, both of them laughing, taken at some reunion. And under it in marker, it says 4 sugars, and nobody who wasn't there understands it, and Torres never explains. He just says, she gave me back, and lets them wonder. His wife Elena sends a tin of something homemade to a hardware store outside Tupelo every Christmas now, to a man named Salter and his daughter and an idiot dog, because Rosa put them all in one another's address books, the way you'd wind a lot of separate clocks, and set them all to the same time. Rosa herself is out, all the way out, this time, for real. She fixes clocks. She took her grandfather's tools out of the felt roll she'd carried through 3 wars and never once opened, and she opened them. And she hung a shingle in a town where nobody knows what her hands used to do. And she sits at a bench with a glass screwed into her eye socket and works on movements so small they'd vanish into the floorboards if she hurried. She does not hurry. She has never in her life been so unhurried. And on the cold mornings and the tired ones, her hands shake, a fine hard tremor she works around now. The way you work around a warped floorboard, planning her grip so the fine work happens between the tremors. And she has learned the rhythm of her own hands so well that the customers never see it, never know that the steadiest clockmaker in the county has a shake she brought back from a morning she doesn't talk about. A young woman came into the shop last month wanting to learn the trade. Rosa took her on, but she doesn't teach her the way her grandfather taught, hovering, taking the tweezers away. She hands them over and lets the girl drop the springs and lose them in the floorboards and swear and find them. Because Rosa learned a thing in 8 months at a coffee stand that her grandfather never knew. That the fastest way to make a person small is to be so good in front of them that they stop reaching. And the kindest thing you can do for someone with good hands is get out of their way and let them be already there. The shop bell rings the way the coffee stand's tin roof used to shiver. Rosa looks up from the movement, level-eyed, unhurried, the glass in her eye, the tremor waiting and worked around, at peace in a way the tower never let her be. A clock she fixed a year ago comes back in for cleaning, still keeping perfect time, still telling its own time, and not anybody's. And she takes it in her shaking, certain hands, and holds it up to the light, and listens to it tick.